Do you remember when you were first told about the birds and the bees? Was it awkward? Was it funny? Was it confusing? For many of us, it came with an understanding of, we don't talk about this. But sexuality and gender have come a long way from behind closed doors. So here to unpack the sex talk of today is Shan Boodram, our girl. Shan, I'm so happy you're with us today. Always great to have you here. Would you say?
Oh, it's a joy. And thank you for that flirty beginning. I'm just so hot over here.
I learned from the best, girl. Would you say talking about sex isn't taboo at all anymore?
No, I could not. I wish I could, but absolutely. It's definitely still taboo and very uncomfortable for a lot of people. And that's okay. That's a starting point. But I do think that we've come a long way. And the sex talk, the sex monologue, I think is now transitioning into the sex dialogue.
Oh, yeah. Okay, growing up for me, like the sex talk, I remember we talked about my period. I don't think we talked about reproduction, maybe a little bit. So can you share your thoughts on the evolution of the sex talk? Like, are we getting better at this talk these days?
Yeah, I think that people thought that when someone turned 16, you would sit them down and try to unpack as much information as you possibly could in a 5 to 7 minute span of time. And that was the sex talk, right? Did you get the talk? Whereas in now, I do think that people are starting to look at it like an ongoing conversation that starts really young. You know, I have a 1-year-old daughter and I talk to her about her nose and her eyes and her other body parts. It's a part of our ongoing dialogue. And so hopefully people are now starting to catch on that we don't wait until they're 16 or 18 or 25 for some people, but we start having this conversation so it becomes comfortable and we build upon it as it becomes more age appropriate.
For sure. It shouldn't even be called the talk because it's the talks. There's so many of them. This is just woven into your life, whether you're at the table eating cereal or whatever. There's always an opportunity to talk about something related to sexuality, gender, all of these things. So I want to ask you this. What has changed the most compared to your sexual experiences now? Like, if you look back at your initial sort of sexual, intimate experiences, is there a big change? And that can be in how you approach it, what you know about it, or just the dialogue surrounding it in the world?
Absolutely. I think that in my early sex days, I was really strict on the social sexual scripts. And that is when you meet somebody and you say all the things that you think you're supposed to say, you do all the things you think you're supposed to do, and you follow along this script. And usually the script, unfortunately, isn't written by our sex ed class or by our parents. It's written by media. In some cases, it's written by online erotic material. So whatever medium you're consuming the most or you feel is giving you the most reliable information, that's what you're mimicking. So I spent a lot of my early intimate years mimicking what I thought I was supposed to do. And it wasn't until I got to my late 20s, to be very honest with you, mid to late 20s, that I was able to really break free of that and say, okay, I don't, wake up in the morning and do my day like anybody else. I don't eat like everybody else. So why am I scripting my intimate life like everybody else's or how I perceived it to be? Because as we know, once we get to know people's true intimate stories, it very rarely is the copy and paste of what we see in popular media. So I think the freedom to express yourself how you want to with other people and alone is the biggest change.
Oh, that is so good. It feels like that's very liberating. Now, if you could go back, what's the one question you wish you'd ask your parents during the sex talk? Because I know for me, I would have asked them if we were open like that. I would have said, like, how do I know that it's the right time to get into a sexual relationship? I don't know. I was just like, everyone's 17 and doing it, so I'm 17, so let's just do it. What would you ask your parents?
I would ask them, what's your biggest regret? Or what's the silliest thing that you did? Or what's the craziest experience you had in your preteens with discovering your body and coming into your sexuality? I think that my parents, in my mind, especially my mom, were perfect sexual beings who did everything right and waited till love and then met my father. And so it was so difficult for me to come to them and try to relate to them as somebody who didn't have it all figured out, who had already, made some mistakes, very early on. So I think humanizing them and them also telling me that it's okay to be imperfect and it's okay to not have it all figured out would have really helped.
Conversations about regret are my favorite conversations because they're learning experiences, right? Like, I want to know all the stuff that I've done wrong are actually really big lessons. So that's a good question. Now, you're a sex educator, and I'm sure you look at Ryu, and you, as you said, like, you're teaching her about her body parts and what to call everything on, on her body and her face. Do you ever think to yourself, how in depth should you go with her when it comes to speaking about sex? And how do you gauge that?
I really think it's about looking for organic lead-ins, and those will come naturally, right? I wouldn't start teaching a kid about algebra at age 4. It just wouldn't be organic, and of course, it wouldn't click for them. So if you look at it like a building block, those questions are gonna come naturally to you. One of my favorite explanations for how a parent talked to their kid about sex was they watched Grey's Anatomy with their kid. And as medical questions came up, they talked about it. As intimate relationships came up, they talked about it. So finding those organic lead-ins, and then above all else, letting the kid lead the conversation. Again, it doesn't have to be the monologue. You don't have to have a prepared speech. You just have to be honest and present. And if you don't know, that is incredibly empowering to say, but I'll find out and we'll talk about it next time.
Absolutely. And then in terms of preparing ourselves to have that talk for parents, how do we get into that mind space? And is it a bad thing? Is it detrimental for parents to not have the sex talk with their kids?
It's detrimental to not have the sex talk with your kid if you don't invest any time in learning about sex and sexuality and seeing what the new terms are, or just engaging in that type of content. I wouldn't have the big how to stop a fire talk with my kid because I don't really know anything about that, right? So I would want a trained professional to give that kind of information if it mattered to me. So if you haven't spent the time educating yourself and informing yourself, being curious and being a student, then no, you can't be a teacher to somebody else. So I think the real big important thing for parents is to acknowledge, hey, I'm feeling really nervous. I'm unsure what to say. I don't know what to talk about. That's a great jump off point to start seeking out information. So if you don't want to do that, then I would say forego the talk and try to find other people who can do it. But if you're up for the challenge, it's one that you are going to benefit from too. So I highly encourage you. And that's, why I love being a part of projects like CBC's The Big Sex Talk, which for me is really multi-generational.
Oh, I want to hear more about that. So tell me about your involvement in this new docu-series. You said the name, The Big Sex Talk.
I'm obsessed with it because literally, Tracy, I left Canada. I'm a proud Canadian because I couldn't find a space for the message that I wanted to share. And then here comes CBC and says, we want to talk about sex. And we're not just talking about half an hour. And we're not just talking about missionary and doggy style. We want to talk about everything. And so it really is a 6-part series that runs the gamut from identity to sexuality, to pleasure, to protection, to technology. And so if you want a jump off point for how to start meaningful conversations about your own sex life, about the sex life of people that you deeply care about, I truly believe that this show can be just that.
I'm so happy that you were involved, that they reached out and they said, Shan, you come back to do this, because
Yes.
it is such an honor. Like, there are certain Canadian milestones. They're always going to be Canadian milestones. So congratulations to you. And I'm happy
Thank
they
you.
have your expertise and your voice behind something that so many people are going to be using as an educational source. Congrats to you, hon. Thank you, Shan.